don't know if you remember much of this, Hugh, but there was a casting kerfuffle on who to cast for Hannibal Lecter, and there was a difference of opinion on what a television network, a traditional television network, would want as a leading man, and what we would want as an actor playing Hannibal Lecter to personify that character. And I think the network wanted somebody that was much more poppy, much more mainstream, much more American, I think, in some ways. And but that was just them thinking about like, okay, how do we get the biggest audience for our television show? We have to cast John Cusack as Hannibal Lecter, and everybody will tune in because won't that be surprising? That was my face. And I was like, well, let's go ahead, make an offer. So there was some resistance to Mads Mikkelsen because he was European, because he was somebody that you could look at and say like, yeah, I buy that he eats people. And, you know, that there was an interesting kind of, we were dealing with a very American network that wanted a very American actor to sell to American audiences. And all the creatives on the show wanted somebody who was the best person for the role. And because we didn't have that kind of John Cusack, Hugh Grant, these are some of the names that the network really wanted in the role, that felt like it was more about selling the movie than making the most authentic movie. And that's not to say that neither of those things are invalid, but because we cast Maz, and because it was sort of it was an interesting dance, because I would say Mads Mikkelsen, and they'd say, no, how about Hugh Grant? I'm like, great, make an offer. He's going to say no. They would make an offer, he'd say no. And I'd be like, what about Mads Mikkelsen? They're like, well, how about John Cusack? And like, great, make an offer. He's going to say no. They'd make an offer, he'd say no. I'd say, what about Mads Mikkelsen? And that was like, that carousel went around for, I think, 3 or 4 months after we had cast Hugh. It was going on for a while. And finally, I just said, like, Maz is the guy, that's the guy that I see in the role, and I have to write it, and I have to champion it, I have to understand it. And Jennifer Salke at NBC, bless her heart, was like, okay, like, that's your guy, and I believe you, and I trust you, and I'm excited about the vision for the show. But for the other sort of marketing folks, they were like, oh, this show isn't going to break through for us. They sort of gave up on it a little bit because we were casting a European guy as the face of that. They wanted to be much more accessible. And I felt that they were right for their reasons, but wrong for my reasons. And so the gift of casting Mads Mikkelsen, is that their investment in the show became dramatically decreased. And so that allowed us to do a lot of things that we wouldn't have been able to do if they were saying like, no, this show needs to get 10 million people watching it every week, because then we would have to really be tied down to certain parameters of storytelling that were going to mesh with a mainstream audience. So Maz was the gift that allowed us to tell the story the way that we wanted to tell it, because the network was like, well, it's not the person that we wanted, and we don't really see him in this role. And we were like, fine, just let us make the show. And they were like, here. And so, you know, we didn't get great ratings, and we didn't get great numbers, and the network was behind us, but they weren't as behind us as they would have been if we had cast who they wanted. But I think in the grand universal scheme, it was the best thing for the show, because we got to have Maz and Hugh in scenes together, and they were electric. And also we got to do things that were questionable with the content, because we were no longer expected to achieve a certain goal.
I think that if you would cast someone like Cusack, let's arbitrarily throw that name out there, they might have insisted more on a procedural show and less serialized storytelling.
They would have insisted on all sorts of things. We wouldn't have got it away with a third of the things that we got away with, or, tried to do in our narratives, just because, low expectations are good. Low expectations will allow artists to flourish in ways that when there are higher expectations and, more restrictions, because there's more writing on it for the network. And that's why they cast James Spader in The Blacklist, because they were like, see, this is what we wanted to do that you wouldn't do. And so we're going to do it. This is our show. You go do your little show. We'll air it. But this is a show that we really wanted to do. And the moment they cast James Spader in The Blacklist was when they kind of took their attention away from what we were doing on Hannibal. So it was really about like, oh, let them do their weird little show. Like, we're not paying very much for it, and we're going to bury it on a Thursday night at 10 or a Friday night at 10. And so we only need it to perform this much. And we performed this much.
But right, and then we became, I suppose, a show that meant something different to them in terms of value, because we got good reviews and because we stuck out in a different way in their roster of shows, right? And that's also a good look. And I think it's something that they were actively interested in pursuing, right? And so we fitted into a different part of the model, which was exactly, I think, where we wanted to be.
Yes, like I think it's where the universe definitely placed us, so we could maximize what we wanted to do.